We've seen how we do this. This will be just a little bit different since you're representing yourself. But yes, let's begin with swearing you in. Go ahead and raise your right hand. You swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to provide is true and accurate.
I do.
Are you the same Charles Isenhart who filed pre-filed testimony and exhibits in this matter?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections to your testimony?
I do not.
I'm going to need to blow this font up. If asked the same questions here today, would you provide substantially the same answers?
Yes.
The board will now allow the parties to conduct their cross-examination. We'll come back to it. The board will now allow parties to conduct their cross-examination. Once the parties finish, the board may ask you questions, if it has any. Upon the conclusions of the cross-examination, you will be allowed to clarify any answers to questions you were asked on cross-examination. This is not a time to begin a new line of questioning or add testimony. Before we take the next step, do you move admission of testimony and exhibits?
Yes, I would move the introduction of my direct testimony and exhibits 2 through 5.
Thank you. Are there objections?
No objection, Your Honor.
Seeing no objections, the board will admit the evidence and give it the weight due. Parties? Mr. Taylor?
Thank you. Representative Isenhart, in your testimony, you alluded to possibly finding a sequestration site in Iowa for the CO2 that is proposed to go into Summit's pipeline. But wouldn't it be better to reduce the production of CO2 in the first place?
I think to the extent that the goal of public policy, as I'm aware, at the federal level, is to reduce atmospheric carbon, there may be alternatives that would be more effective to accomplish that.
Such as?
Personally, I'm a fan of reducing the consumption of greenhouse gases across the board, electric vehicles, finding new ways for agricultural production that might be less carbon intensive. I think the testimony we've heard here is that basically we have a virtuous cycle where carbon is taken out of the atmosphere in the process of being put back into the atmosphere, but this project would intercept it before it did so for the purpose of sequestration. I don't oppose the concept of carbon sequestration.
But would you agree there are more effective ways to do it?
There, 9.5 million tons, there could be. I can't testify to what they might be today.
In your testimony, you said you don't think that Summit has supplied sufficient evidence that the project has significant climate benefit. Can you explain why you feel that way?
I did ask a number of questions through a data collection effort, through discovery, asking if there had been any comprehensive evaluation or data showing from a project standpoint A to Z, which for me would include not just the pipeline, but also the carbon capture, the sequestration, and all of the activities involved in creating ethanol, that I had not seen the kind of data that would show a net benefit if you include all the relevant aspects of what that equation might involve.
So are you referring to what we might call a life cycle evaluation?
Yes.
Yeah, and you didn't see that?
I have not seen that.
You mentioned asking some questions or data requests. Are you referring to the questions that you had as part of your direct testimony?
Yes.
And you received no response?
I did receive a response.
Oh, okay. What was the response? I haven't seen it.
He's asked me to read from the exhibit. Is that something you want me to do?
Well, I'm just asking what somewhat responded to your questions, because I don't know that we've seen those. Maybe they were filed and I missed it.
I think if you call up my Exhibit 2, and I don't know exactly what questions, what numbers those might be.
Yeah, but you did file the answers then?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Duplinsky was very prompt in getting the initial responses to my questions.
Sometimes.
They were complicated questions, some of them, so I give them some credit for that.
Were there any of those responses that you felt were insufficient, or that perhaps need more expansion or clarification?
I'm still not convinced, based on what I've seen, either that's been provided directly as this case or otherwise, that a life cycle benefit from a atmospheric carbon reduction standpoint has been made. I think similar to the request for more thorough external testimony regarding the economics, I think similar external testimony should be given towards the, I guess I would call it the environmental economics of the proposal.
And by environmental economics, what do you mean?
Basically how, and in specific terms, the project will result in what I call net reductions in atmospheric carbon, which is, I think, a different question than how much carbon dioxide is sequestered.
How is that different?
Well, if you look at the life cycle analysis of any project, there are emissions created by the project that need to be accounted for. Some people would say that to the extent this benefits the ethanol industry and corn farmers indirectly, would result in either a continuation or expansion of corn production. And by the time you look at manufacturing fertilizer and all the carbon emissions associated with that corn production, it may result in a different outcome as far as that conclusion.
Okay. Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you. Mr. Whippel?
Thank you, Your Honor. Representative Isenhart, you have in your career in the legislature served on the Ways and Means Committee, is that right?
Yes.
Do you believe that the tax credit financing costs of the project should be factored into the board's balancing test?
Could you rephrase that in terms of what tax credit costs? What do you mean by that?
The 45Q and the 45Z tax credits that the federal government has created to subsidize the sequestration of carbon, which you've said you don't oppose. But I think a question of more pertinence for the board, rather, is how should those credits be considered as part of the balancing test that it weighs? What is your opinion on that?
Well, I think I would get back a little bit to what Mr. Taylor asked. What would be the alternatives, and what would be more effective use of public monies if those alternatives were pursued? And would we consider on an absolute basis those credits to be a good investment based on the net life cycle atmospheric carbon reduction that would result from the project?
That might be the case as a question of public policy, but in terms of the determination in this case, should it be a cost or a benefit, the federal credits?
Well, you're talking to a public policy maker, so that's why I'm here to testify. I think personally we always should give more scrutiny to tax credits as opposed to direct appropriations to simply pay for activities, because typically those tax credits don't come up for regular review. Are they actually achieving the goals that we intended? And if not, should we reconsider the use of those monies?
Cost or benefit, Representative Isenhart?
It's a cost to the taxpayer for sure.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you. Mr. Jorde?
Would any of your opinions given be different if the state of Iowa went about this project and it was going to be publicly owned, essentially, that the government of the state was doing it rather than a private corporation?
Well, if it were a public project, I'm not sure it would come before the Utilities Board for review. I'm not aware that the Utilities Board needs to approve the use of eminent domain by a public entity. The courts may end up having that right, but by definition, if it's the state doing it, I think that would be de facto a public convenience and necessity.
Do you believe that the state of Iowa is missing out on an opportunity or the ability to perhaps sequester within the state of Iowa rather than the need for miles of pipeline outside of the state?
If in fact that were feasible, I think would be a missed opportunity if it were not explored.
Is that one of your criticisms of the project, or?
It is one of the reasons I introduced an exhibit by Mr. Schilling of the Iowa Geological Survey related to how much it would cost in general terms for them to do the exploration and science needed to determine if it was feasible.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I don't have anything further.
Are there any further questions from the parties? Seeing none, Mr. Isenhart, Representative Isenhart, you may redirect yourself as it's related to the questions that were asked.
I don't have any redirect, but I'd hate to not have to answer questions from a former state representative.
That's for you. Your time is appreciated. Thank you very much. Give you a minute to return to your seat and call your next witness.